In this video, we're going to use Spring REST with path variables. And to kind of help us out with path variables, we'll have this new endpoint to retrieve a single student by the ID. So we'll make a GET request to API/students/student ID, and this will retrieve a single student. Now, the student ID in curly braces here, this is known as a path variable, such that when we actually access it via our REST client, we can include an actual value there. So we could say /API/students/0, that'll give us the student with ID 0, 1, 2, and so on. So basically a way of parameterizing your path or the endpoint to actually accept data. Now let's kind of look at this as far as the big picture here. So we'll have our REST client, and then over on the far right, we'll have our REST service. So we'll make a call /API/students/student ID in curly braces. And again, that's our path variable. So then it'll return back that given student. So here, we're just making up an example. It'll return back Mario Rossi. Now, again, we'll actually write the code here for the REST service. We'll add a new request mapping for this. And in our coding, we'll actually create a new student, or we'll retrieve that given student and then pass it back. And just as a reminder, Jackson's going to actually convert that student object to JSON. Alrighty, so let's kind of look and see how this works behind the scenes. So we have our REST client and our REST service. We'll make a request across for /API/students/student ID, and the student ID is in curly braces. And then we'll have Spring REST along with Jackson. They'll make a call to the REST service. So in our code, we'll actually return that given student. And then Jackson will actually convert that student object or that student POJO to JSON and then send it back across to the REST client. And you've kind of seen this process before, but I simply wanted to show you the information again, along with just using a single student object as opposed to an array list. So the development process is fairly straightforward. All we need to do is add a request mapping to our Spring REST service, and then we'll simply bind the path variable to the method parameter using this new annotation called @pathVariable. And we'll see coding examples of this coming up. Alrighty, so let's kind of dig in and let's write some code here. With our student REST controller that we already seen before, request mapping /API, student REST controller, then our little comment here is that we're going to define an endpoint for /students/student ID in curly braces, and we'll basically return the student at the given index. So I'll set up this request mapping here for a get mapping /students/student ID in curly braces. I define a method, get student, that returns a student, and then I have the @pathVariable int student ID. So this will basically bind that path variable that's coming in on that URL, and I'll actually bind it and assign it to this variable here that I have as a method parameter, student ID. And by default, both of those names must match up. Alrighty, so that's the piece there. Now we simply just create our array list of students, and then we just kind of go through the process of populating the students, kind of like we did in the previous videos. And now we can simply return that desired student. So instead of using a real student ID, we'll simply just use that as an index. We'll simply index into the list and then return that given student. But don't worry, we'll do all the fancy database stuff later when we set up our full CRUD application using Hibernate. But this is kind of enough to kind of get us started. And remember, when this student object is actually returned, then Jackson will actually convert that student to JSON, and then it'll go back to the calling program. Alrighty, so that's the basic coding. We'll move into Eclipse in the next video, and then we'll write this code, and we'll actually do a small bit of refactoring of our previous project just to kind of clean it up a bit. But I'll show you how all that works in the next video. So see ya over there.